How's it going? Andrew here with a brand new painting video, and it's great to be back with you once again. In this video, I want to share with you some of my favorite portrait painting techniques. Now, I've been away for a little while, but I've been working in the background putting together my brand new portrait painting tutorial. And this thing is massive. It's really comprehensive, and I've got 2 demonstrations that I include in the full tutorial. But in this little video, I want to talk to you about one of those demonstrations and just show you the highlights and share with you some of my favorite hyper-realistic portrait painting techniques. Now, when I'm working in a hyper-realistic manner, it takes me a long time to build up that surface and just layer those details to create that richness that I'm really going for. I want to create a convincing sense of reality so that the viewer feels like they're there with the person. Now, this means that sometimes it's just not practical to work from a live model. So it's easier for me when working in this way to take those photographs back into the studio and really take my time with the painting. So I organized a model for a photo shoot, and here is Riri, and I thought she had a fantastic look about her. I took her to the seaside, and I just loved the way that light shone off her face. And the combination of her hair, those facial features, and skin complexion, I thought would lead to a fantastic painting. The added bonus was being by the seaside would start to bring through some of that imagery, and I could start to create a bit of a story with the figure in front of the sea. So I was really enthusiastic about these images, and I thought it would make a great final painting. So I brought these images back into the studio, and I was reflecting on the idea, and I thought a second photo shoot would really be needed. What I was missing was something with the clothing. It just sloped off the shoulders a bit too much, and I thought maybe something with a structured collar or a jacket, something she could pull closed, might be a lot better. So I organized a second photo shoot, and we headed back out to the same location, and I was much happier with the results this time. I thought that the added structure in that collar was brilliant, especially the way she pulled it closed, almost as if she was trying to keep warm and protecting herself from the chill. Now, even though I was happier with these photographs, I thought it might be a good idea, while I had her, to go out into another location and just try and mix it up a bit and get a bit more variety into the photos. So we went to a garden, and this time we photographed near a place called Larnac Castle in Dunedin. Now, these were fantastic gardens, and there were so many elements here that I thought would make great imagery for a painting. But I was really taken with this scenario where Riri was in an archway, a garden archway, and that dappled light was filtering through and hitting her face. I thought this was a really subtle look and would lend itself to a great painting as well. Also, I thought there was a lot of potential here with that contrast in color between the green bushes and leaves and that bright red scarf. Now, I have a bit of a situation on my hands. I like both of these images, this one from the garden and this image from the seaside. And whenever I'm in this predicament and I can't decide which one to paint, I go ahead and make a color study. So I decide to go for the garden scenario first and make a smaller version of the final portrait. Now, I never find a photograph that I'm totally satisfied with where I want to copy it exactly. I often want to make changes, and here, this photograph is no different. I'm identifying several things that I'm just not happy with. It's got the good bones of a painting, but it just needs to be pushed that much further. The scarf is far too dominant. That bright red color is really competing with her face and leaching all of the heat and vibrancy out of the lips and cheeks. I changed this to a deep burgundy color, and already I'm paying more attention to those facial features. The jacket is far too light, tonally speaking, so I decided to darken this somewhat, and already the face and neck and that skin tone is starting to come through more and more. Now, I really love to paint hair in the sunlight, and this is going to add some real interest to the bottom section of this portrait. I also love dappled light on the face, so I'm going to have some more of this coming through, and it's going to create more interest up in this area as well. Now, I want some brighter greens coming through in the background, and the green and red contrast is going to be quite dynamic in the portrait because green and red are complementary opposites, sitting opposite one another on the color wheel. Now this is my completed reference, and this is the image that I'll be making my study from. It's got all of the elements that I really like, and it's going to be a lot of fun to paint. Now I made all of these changes by importing this image into Photoshop and then isolating individual areas and then changing them one at a time. Now on a homemade Belgian linen panel at 11 by 14 inches, I begin to sketch up exactly where my figure is going to go. Paying close attention to the top of the head as well as the chin, making sure that I have enough space for everything below. I divide the face up proportionally by finding some key lines, the top of the hairline and the bottom of the chin, but also the line where the eyes run through. And from here, it makes it relatively easy to locate the nose and the mouth. I then divide the face vertically, and this helps me achieve a sense of symmetry. And from here, this simple framework helps me identify and locate all of the individual facial features. The eyes go about this line, and from here it becomes relatively easy to locate the nose and flesh this area out, as well as the eyebrows and the nasal ridge. And again, with the lips, I identify that line and then draw the top lip and the bottom lip below it. Now, once I'm happy with the overall structure of the face, I then go about shoring up my drawing by darkening some of these lines. You see here, I've rubbed out some of those construction lines in the face, cleaning up the appearance a little bit. Now, because this is a sketch, I'm trying to keep things much looser and trying to achieve this a lot quicker than I would for the bigger painting. So here I'm going to be using some big and bold brushwork, especially in the background, and I'm knocking this in with a combination of ultramarine blue and burnt umber to achieve that depth of tone. And my greens consist of transparent yellow oxide, cadmium yellow, and ultramarine blue. Now I'm going to talk about my color mixing and the palette in length in the full version of this tutorial. But here with my color study, what I'm trying to do is block in the face using these tiles of color, as well as this bristle dagger brush. Now, if you haven't already heard of the Tish brush, then find that link in the description below. This thing is dynamite for blocking in paintings really quickly. It gives me so much control and versatility with the types of marks that I can make. I can either use the flat blade of the brush or the broad side of the brush, or just the very end for more control. And I'm using this here to create these tiles of color, as I've said, but also blend a moderate amount between my strokes. Now, the colors here are much cooler by appearance with the contrast of that warm base that it's painted over. It often looks a little bit weird when you first start painting your portrait, especially if you're working over a burnt umber ground like I'm doing here. With my colors in this part of the portrait, I'm looking for a difference between the cool ambient light shining from above and that warm heat given by the skin. And this contrast between the warm and the cool I really enjoy. And when we balance these colors out just right, we can start to create a bit of a three-dimensional form. Also, you'll notice some really interesting colors starting to come through in the face, like greens and blues. Now, often we don't think about using green and blue in a portrait, but there's so much variation in the colors that we can see in people. And you can see as I progress with this portrait, those colors don't seem so odd. Now suddenly they start talking with one another and start reacting in a really nice way. I then go about blocking in the lips and then focus on those finer facial features. As a general rule of thumb, I start general, loose, and blocky, and then work my way towards specifics. Once I'm happy with the way the face is looking, I can then go about mapping in some more of these tones around the face, working in the hair as well as the jacket and the scarf. And as I start to introduce darker tone here, notice how much brighter the face and neck is starting to appear. Everything on your canvas is relative to everything else. So we must completely block that canvas in order for us to gauge if this is working or not. So it does help having a technique that allows you to get there quickly. And the brush, I must say, again, really helps me achieve this speed and, at the same time, a bit of control. Now, using a very small dagger brush, I map in the eyebrows and some of those finer facial features. I'm going for a nice, loose, and painterly look within this sketch in some of the areas. However, this hair that's exposed in the sunlight, I'm going to start to mark this in with a very fine 00 sable round. This allows me to achieve finer lines here, and I like that contrast between the loose brushwork and some of these finer marks. It really brings attention to some of these areas that are in the sunlight by having that contrast between the loose and the refined. Now, you must have heard me say this before, but in this portrait, it's no different. Save your tonal best for last. And here, these are the fine white marks that I'm applying through the hair, but also that dappled sunlight in the face. Once I'm happy with the way the tones are registering, I go about rounding out some of these facial features and make some of my last marks on the portrait. By creating a color sketch, this gives me a practice run for that big final painting. It gives me a chance to review my techniques and the overall process so that I know the road ahead. I've spent years in the studio engaged in abortive work, and I decided enough. I didn't want to do any paintings that were just destined for the trash can. But here, this allows me to understand what's going to happen in that final painting so that I can better prepare myself for it. Now, I've invested about 6 to 8 hours in this little color study, which might seem like a lot, but not when you consider how much time it's going to save in the final portrait. Now, I'm really happy with the way this little color study turned out, but I'm not convinced it's going to make the best final portrait. So I give it another shot, and this time I'm working with the scenario that we photographed near the seaside, and I thought some aspects of this would make a fantastic final painting. So I get stuck into this, applying the exact same techniques. Now, this portrait really does have a similar lighting scenario with that ambient light shining off the side of the head. But what I really love in this is that brightly illuminated hair. This is going to be a fantastic opportunity to show some detailed techniques, but also it's just so much fun creating that contrast between the light and the dark. This really does help round out a three-dimensional form as well. And here I'm using a broken fan brush to brush in some of that lighter hair detail. Now, this small study was painted much faster in only about 2.5 hours, and it does look much looser, but upon finishing this sketch, I realized I was onto a better idea. I'm never worried about wasting time in the studio. Every opportunity that I get to make another study, another sketch, is an opportunity for me to get to know my subject better. Now, I feel confident that I've chosen the better of those two color studies to work up into a bigger painting, and I'm working on a piece of Belgian linen stretched around a wooden frame measuring 20 by 30 inches. I sketched this up in exactly the same way, and you notice here that it's toned in a similar fashion to those studies. Once I've mapped out the facial features and toned the face a bit more with burnt umber, I go about blocking in some of these colors. And again, I'm focused on that difference between the cool ambient glow from the sky above and that warmth coming through the skin. And I notice on this side of her face, there's a lot more of that cool light. I'm not worried about the colors looking exactly correct right off the bat. I know they're not going to, but what I try to do is just give it my best shot and then work these colors together so that they start to form a relationship with one another. And it's this difference between my tones and the interaction between them that starts to create that illusion of skin. It's very difficult to get it to look realistic right off the bat, so I never expect it to. I just give it my best shot and try and block in these colors quickly. And you'll notice here again, I'm using that wedge brush, and I've left these areas of the eyes, nose, and lips to come back to later and fill in with a bit more detail. But next I apply that darker tone of the hair, which is a combination of ultramarine blue and burnt umber again, with the slightest amount of perylene crimson coming through to give it some more heat. Now, with the background, I want this to appear loose and painterly, and again, have some difference in the painting so that there's a contrast between this loose, almost abstract background and the fine, sharp detail of the facial features. I think this will create some really nice tension in the final portrait. So I don't want any sharpness back here in the background whatsoever, which means I avoid that dead flat line of the horizon by breaking this up with some loose brushwork. And hopefully this has a similar character to that tumultuous sea behind our model. Now, for the finer facial features, I'll use a filbert bristle brush, and this allows me a bit more control because those bristles are packed a bit tighter together. And I'll use this for just blocking in the whites in the eyes, as well as those irises, so that now we can start to establish the direction of the gaze. Now everything in the portrait is pretty wet so far. I'm using Liquid Original throughout this painting, which is an alkyd resin. It adds a little bit more flow to the paint, and it also does dry pretty quickly. Overnight, this will be a dry surface for me to layer more details over the top. But right now, before it's set up, I have the opportunity to push and pull some of my colors and even blend between strokes. Now I'm working pretty thin, but I can still see some ridge lines picking up that ambient light from above, and this might be a distraction down the track. So what I do is I smooth these out with a softer brush, and this will allow me to have a much smoother surface to layer those details over. I'm always on the lookout for anything that's going to form a problem or a distraction down the track. So the block-in is best kept thin. Now I'm happy with the general location of all of my facial features, even though they might have migrated out of position slightly. The main aim of this block-in is to just get that color down. I can always go back and adjust it once this layer has completely dried by just moving the edges slightly. Now that's our block-in finished. And the block-in is our first initial opportunity to get down as much color as possible, covering that entire canvas. But here we're trying to keep things simple. We're not trying to go for a finished portrait right out of the gates. What we're going for is just the base. Now from here, I get to model, which means I'm going to build up that surface a little bit more and start layering on top of the block-in. Now because I'm using Liquid Original here for this demonstration, that block-in is completely dry before I go over the top with my modeling. And then from there, I can start to work in some finer details. At this point in the process, my brushes are starting to get smaller, and I'm controlling my brush strokes a little bit more, paying close attention to those transitions of color to define that form. I'll go back and blend a moderate amount between strokes to soften out the face. Now's the time where I start paying closer attention to my tones and really start to work in some of those deeper shadows as well as some of those lighter lights. Again, staying well away from the top of my tonal range as well as the bottom. So I don't want to go for anything here that is pure white or black. I want to make sure that I still have plenty of room to go. But that said, I'm able to manipulate these skin tones to create a little more three-dimensionality throughout the face. And through this process, the face is beginning to appear rounder and smoother. And this is the interim step between that block-in and the detail, just preparing the way for those final marks. Now I'm almost ready for detail, but before I do, I need to address the surface quality. Now it's often the case with oil painting that some of the areas in the paint surface will appear sunken or matte. This is nothing to worry about, it's just the nature of the material. So I go about a process called oiling out or oiling in, and for this here I'm using just pure Liquid Original. Now there's not much danger to using this product in this fashion because I'm only using a very thin amount, although it needs to be done over a completely dried painting and then wiped away with a clean rag. And now I have a much better idea of what my tones and colors are doing before carrying on with that final detail. Now I'm building up the surface of the face just one small brush stroke at a time, paying very close attention to my photographic reference. I'm taking some cues here that I can see in my images, and I'm noticing that warm skin tone showing through in some of the shadow areas, and the way this contrasts with that cool ambient skylight shining from above. Now when I'm applying this technique, it helps to have a couple of brushes on the go at once, one reserved for that cool color and the other reserved for the warm. Now some of the smaller bristle daggers tend to splay apart as they get used, but to me this is perfect for applying things like eyebrows. If I need a finer line, I'll use an ivory dagger like what I'm doing here to apply these eyelashes. This helps me achieve some more controlled marks. So what I'm balancing is this variety of brush strokes to create this detail and build it up just bit by bit. I'm often thinking about the painting and wondering it to myself, what kind of brush would make a mark to communicate this particular phenomenon? And you'll notice that that results in a whole variety of different shapes to the brush to help create that detail. Here I'm using a series of synthetics, long flats and filberts. And this gives me a little more control to be able to manipulate those skin tones, as well as create more sharp detail in areas like the nostrils and around the eyes. Now notice how this new layer of paint, this fresh color, is going in and it's slightly different than what it's going over. Every time I have the opportunity to build up that surface, I do change those layers between, and this helps me give that portrait more richness. There's always gaps between my brushstrokes where that underlying color is showing through. This again is why I like to work over a colored ground, because it does provide so much warmth. Now, as I'm building up these layers, I can slowly manipulate the surface of the skin using this push-pull effect. And one of my favorite ways to do this is by applying a technique called glazing. Now, I glaze only over a dried painting, which is what you see here. And I begin mixing a very fluid amount of paint using just pure medium and transparent colors, and I'll reserve this mixture for my dark glazes. This is where I'll lightly apply the faintest shadows to areas like the forehead, and this will give me the illusion that she's furrowing her brow. It's about a light touch here. Now, contrasted with those dark fluid glazes are my light glazes, which are a little bit more opaque, which has far less medium in it. And these are the lighter areas of that ambient light shining from above. And it's this difference between that dark and that light that really goes to create the three-dimensionality within the portrait. You can really build up a photorealistic surface quite quickly by using these techniques. Now here, with just the end of a round synthetic brush, I'm going to apply some tears, and I have to do this again over a dry painting. I'll smear this mark slightly so it doesn't seem too heavy-handed. Now it's a matter of preference to how far you want to push your portraits, but for this I really wanted to include as many different aspects of her face that I could, and here this includes the freckles. Now this again is a glazing technique using a similar fluid mixture and using transparent darker colors, mainly burnt umber, perylene crimson, and turquoise phthalo. I'll go back and manipulate and adjust some of these freckles after I've put them on. Similarly, I can add some of these bloodshot portions to the face and the chin, further pushing that realism. Now our portrait is getting really close, but it's time to pay attention to some of this hair, and it helps if we build this up in a systematic way. You'll notice that the hair is looking pretty flat, so I go about achieving a bit more texture and build up that surface a bit more. So here I'm getting out more paint and applying it with a bristle dagger brush. Once I have a suitable base, I'll then focus on the hair detail, and this is drawn in with a trimmed synthetic rigger. Now I trim these brushes down to have the minimal amount of bristles possible so that it carries a nice thin line. Now this technique does take a lot of time, but it's really rewarding. I'm not painting every single hair, but I'm going for a collection of hairs that will give me the illusion of detail across the entire painting. So I'm just catching those hairs with a bit of that sunlight that's coming through. It does help applying this sort of detail over a dry surface, but sometimes if the liquid started to go off and has set up a bit of a tack or it's a bit sticky still, it can really accept those fine brush marks well, and you can blend out slightly towards the end, tapering the mark. And notice how the mass of the hair is built up with many different colors. I've got several different warm tones as well as dark tones, and then finally I'll apply the brightest marks where the sun is reflecting off the curling hair. And notice the difference between this fine detail in the hair and that blocky background. This is what helps create that three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. As I get to this point in the painting process, I start getting more and more excited because I can see that all of these techniques coming together are starting to create that three-dimensionality. Now, there are no shortcuts to creating a portrait like this, but it does help having some sort of methodology. And this is what I am so excited to finally share with you. So there you have it. There's a sneak peek at my painting portraits tutorial, now available on DVD and download. Now, of course, there is so much more that I've packed into the full version of this tutorial. It's 7.5 hours long, with not just one demonstration, but two, showing you two different ways that you can achieve a realistic result with your portraits. We're going to talk about things like design, creating these color studies, and creating the overall concept to ensure success with the final painting. We're also going to talk about proportion and how to create a likeness within the portrait. Now, one of the things we haven't talked about much here, but I focus on a lot in the full version of the tutorial, is color mixing. And I've included several palette shots in the full version to show you exactly what I'm mixing on my palette and how I create those skin tones. The other thing we're going to talk about is how to use that oil paint to create some really cool three-dimensional effects. Now, when I first started oil painting, I really struggled creating that convincing sense of reality within my images. And it took me well over a decade to build up the techniques and the confidence to be able to do it on a consistent basis. One of the things that was missing was a methodology, a systematic approach to the canvas to ensure my success every time. And that's exactly what I'm going to share with you in the full version of this tutorial. I'm going to share with you my techniques openly. Now, it is my mission to help you improve your painting. Now, I am so confident that you're going to enjoy my brand new tutorial, Painting Portraits, that I'm willing to offer you 100% money back if you don't enjoy it. No questions asked. Simply click that link down in the description below and it will take you to my website where there's some more information for you. As always though, you can hit me up through the website by filling in that contact form if you've got any questions. Now, I really hope that you've enjoyed this little video, and if you did, hit that like button for me. If you want to come back for more and see more painting videos just like this one, make sure you subscribe to this channel as well. As always, you can find me on Instagram and Facebook, but most important, make sure you're subscribed through my website at andrewtischler.com. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.